Welcome back everyone to part 2 of this bow and arrow series. In this part, we will set up the aim animation of our player, and I will teach you how to blend upper body animations with lower body animations to be able to move and jump with the lower body while holding an aim pose with the upper body. We will also be setting up the aim animation for the bow that is synchronized with the aim animation from the player. And we will also spawn the arrow, as well as start looking into how to shoot the arrow. So let's get started. Alright, now last time we left our aim state just like this, which modifies the camera and the character movement, but there is no aim animation, so the player doesn't actually do an aim animation or aim pose. So let's start doing that. Now the animation that I'll be using is here in my player folder, animation, bow aim. This is an animation I got from Mixamo, but I modified the speed and the duration just to make it a quick and snappy animation. I'll share the name of the assets from Mixamo in the description if you want to download the same one, or of course if you want to use my adjusted animation, you can get it on my Patreon. So the first thing we need to do is add this animation to our animation blueprint. So let's open up our ABP player. And we want to check when the player is aiming. And we do have in the player an aim variable. It's actually not on the player itself, but in the bow mechanics component that we created. So if I right click and go to edit AC bow mechanics, we're going to use this is aiming boolean. And if we are aiming, we're going to do an aim animation. Now, for an animation blueprint, anytime you want to use a variable, you have to duplicate that variable in the event graph here. Just like the direction, the is falling, the ground speed, all these variables that we're using, we have to create a copy for them in our animation blueprint. So to do that, we're going to get our character, and notice that this is a character and not cast to a player. Now I can cast it to a player and then get the AC bow mechanics from it, but I can also do get a component by class. So this searches for a component in this character by the class AC bow mechanics. This way you can use the same animation blueprint on any character that has this component, so not necessarily a player. But we need to, of course, make sure that it is valid, just in case you are using this animation blueprint on a character that doesn't have AC bow mechanics. So if it is valid, we are going to get the variable that is called is aiming, and we are going to promote it to a variable in our animation blueprint called is aiming as well. And then we're going to connect this to the sequence here. So I added a pin and just connected it here. All right, and we're just going to comment this and call it is aiming. And now we can use this variable in our animation graph. So going to our anim graph here. Now I'm going to show you first the wrong way to do it, and then I'm going to show you the right way to do it. So let's say we just go to our locomotion state, right? So we have the walk run. Now I can add a new state here. So right click and add state and call it aiming state, right? And then inside this state, I'm going to double click it. Inside this state, I can put my animation. So my bow aim animation and just plug it in here. And make sure it's not looping. So now I can add transitions. So when do you go to from walk run to is aiming? So I'm going to pull an arrow here. You go from walk run to is aiming in this transition. So I'm going to double click it. If the variable is aiming is true. So if is aiming is true, then you can enter this transition. And on the way back, so from aiming to walk run, the opposite. If is aiming is not. So search for not boolean is not true. Right, and this will simply move from the walk run state to the aiming state. And let's see what that looks like. So if I play now and I right click, you see I'm aiming. And you might think, great, it's working. And as soon as I stop aiming, I'm back in walk run. But why is this the wrong way? Because right now, when I move, I'm not doing the walk run animations. And most of the, what we want is actually to blend the walk run animation with the aiming animation, because we want to do both. There are two ways of doing it. Either you get an animation, an aiming animation that also has a walk run, and you create a completely separate locomotion for when you're not aiming, and another locomotion state or blend space for when you are aiming. Or the way which I prefer which is to reuse the same blend space that we have, the regular walk run animation, but blend the lower body, just the lower body of the walk run, with the upper body of the aim animation. That way you don't have to get completely new animations for walking while aiming. And I'm going to show you how we're going to do that. All right, so back in our animation blueprint, our ABP player, first I'm going to actually get rid of, this because I mentioned this is the wrong way of doing it. And now what we want, so we have this locomotion state and we have this main state. I'm going to create a new state machine. So I'm going to create a state machine here and call it the upper body. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because we're going to have two upper body animations. We're going to have an aiming upper body animation and a drawing the bow upper body animation. So I'm going to have these in their own state machine. And just like we do here, we're going to create a cache of it. A cache is basically just creating a variable out of a state machine so you can use it as a single variable. So you do that by pulling off and saying a new saved cache pose, so this one. And I'm going to call it the upper body. So inside this upper body state machine, I'm going to double click it and I'm going to add a new state and I'm going to call it aiming. And then I'm going to do the same thing. So inside this aiming, I'm just going to put my bow aim animation. And right now we don't have any transitions because as soon as you are in this state machine, the default state is aiming. But this is not, we're not using it yet. So how do we use this upper body animation and blend it with the lower body? So to do that, we're going to go back to our anim graph here. And after the main states, we're going to do something called a layered blend per bone. So search for layered blend per bone. And what this does is it takes a base pose and second pose, and it blends between them based on the setup that you give it. So I'm going to open here my layer setup, and you'll see that it has this branch filter. So I'm going to click plus, and I'm going to add a bone name. This is the bone where you want to start blending from. In my case, it's spine _ 2. So if you click on the skeleton, you'll see that spine _ 2 is pretty much here. So this is where the upper body starts. And then you need a blend depth. Blend depth is how many bones up the chain should it blend with. So the higher that number, the more smoothed out the body will be. So I'm going to do something like 4. You can play around with that number, see what fits your specific animation. And it's very important to select also mesh space rotation blend. This makes the blend itself in mesh space instead of global or local space. So how do we use it? So now we have a base pose, and we have, we have two poses that we have to select. So the base pose here is going to be our main state. So just pull this one. And our blend pose is going to be our upper body animations. So I'm going to get the variable that we created, or the cached pose, just by searching for upper body. So use cached pose upper body. And then the output is these two blended together. So I'm going to just plug it here. Now, this is not the final step, but let me show you what it looks like. So right now I'm not aiming actually, and we're still doing the blend, right? So if I'm aiming, I'm doing it correctly, but if I'm not aiming, I'm still doing the aim animation. So is aiming is actually not used anywhere. So we only actually want to do this blend. So we want to blend the upper body with the lower body if we are aiming. And if we're not aiming, we want to use the regular main state. So how do we do that? There is another blend called blend poses by bool. So blend pose by bool is kind of an if statement in animation graphs. So if something, which in our case is aiming, then do this blend thing. But if you're not aiming, I want you to use the regular main states. And this is the reason we create actually variables out of these. I can't copy this main state and paste it. This is going to create a new state machine for it. So if I want to use this here and also use it here, I need to create a cached pose for it. So let me do that also here. Main states, pull off and say new saved cache pose, call it main states. Now I can use it in two places. So here I can use my cache for main states. And this one I can copy and paste anywhere I want because it's technically a variable or a reference. All right, so now if we are aiming, we use this cool blend that we did, and if we're not aiming, use your regular main states. And let's plug that in. Nice, so now I'm not aiming, and I'm doing walk run, and as soon as I aim, I am aiming and walk running at the same time. Now, because we're also blending with the main states, which include the jump animation, when I jump, I'm doing the jump animation in the lower body, but I'm keeping the aim animation in the upper body. Now, this again is a very cool way of doing something like an aim, because you don't need a jump while aiming animation, a move while aiming animation. You can just use everything you had and blend a new upper body animation only. All right, now next thing we want to do is actually animate the bow itself. So when I aim, you see that the bow string is not pulled, right? So we want, when we aim and when we draw the bow itself gets animated. So the string gets pulled and the bow is deformed slightly. Now I have animations for my bow here. Animations. So I have the idle animation, which is just idle, doesn't do anything. And I have this draw half animation. And half, because when you aim, you just draw the bow halfway. And then when you are actually pulling the bow to fire, you draw it full way. So this animation I timed perfectly with the Mixamo animation that I sped up so that they both look smooth and fit together. So let me show you how we're going to use this animation. First of all, in our BP bow, so here, we need a new variable to tell us if we're aiming or not, because we don't want to use the variable of the player. We want the bow to maintain its own state. But here we're not going to use a Boolean like the player. We're going to use an enum, because the bow can be in multiple states. It can be in the aim state or the draw state. So we want to create an enum to make things a bit cleaner. So if you don't know an enum, so I'm going to right click here and search for enumeration. An enum is just a list of possible values. So I'm going to call it bow state. And then you open it up. I'm going to add 3 states. That's none. So it's the idle state. So you can also call it idle maybe. Then you have aim, the aim state, and the draw. So draw means pulling the string all the way. And then I'm going to create a variable inside the bow itself and call it the just state. Or we can call it bow state just to be clear. And we're going to search, the type will be our enum that we just created, bow state. Perfect. So now we want to set the state when we start aiming. And if you recall, starting the aiming happens in our actor component, AC bow mechanics. So here we have aim begin and aim end. So once the aim begins, we set is aiming to true on the player, and we do some things for character movement. Then right after, we are going to get a reference to our bow. So do we have a reference to the bow? No. So when we equip the bow, we need to store it as a variable so that we get a reference to it. So over here, right after spawn actor, I'm going to promote this to a variable and call it our bow ref. And let's use the target from here to avoid overlapping connections. All right, so now we have a reference to our bow. Great. So over here, I'm going to get my bow ref, and I'm going to set bow state. So this is the variable of the enum that we just created, to aim. Or maybe aiming is a better name, doesn't matter. And then when the aim is ending here, I'm going to set it back to idle. Whoops, I got an error because I probably didn't compile my bow. Okay, now I compiled my bow and we're good. All right, so now all we do is we set a variable, but we don't do anything with the variable, so obviously nothing will happen. So what we want is for the bow to animate the same way the player animates. And to do that, we need to create an animation blueprint for our bow. So in the animations folder, I'm going to right click here, search for animation blueprint, and call it the ABP bow. Oh, sorry, I have to pick the skeleton first. The skeleton is our bow skeleton, SK bow, and call it ABP bow. All right. So we're going to open it up. It's going to be a simple animation blueprints. First, we're just going to have a single state. So add, call it new state machine, or just state machine without new. Yeah. So state machine, and we're going to call it, I don't know, main states or something. And then inside it, we are going to have, where's my asset browser? Asset browser. We are going to have our states. So the entry state is idle. Oh, sorry. First, we have to create. Yeah, when you pull, it will be created automatically, but you can also right click and say add state. So this is going to be our idle state, and we're going to also have a state for aiming. So when you enter, you go to idle, and from idle, you can go to aiming, and from aiming, you can go back to idle. We're going to set up these transitions, but let's put the animations first. So in idle, I'm going to put this one. Usually you'd make an idle animation looping, but this animation is a single frame, so it doesn't matter if it's looping or not, won't look any different. To make it looping, you just click on loop animation here, by the way. And in our aiming states, I'm going to put our bow draw half. This one, and this one you don't want looping. And then back in our transitions. So when we go from idle to aiming, if the bow state is aiming, and we go from aiming to idle if the bow state is idle. But we don't have a variable for bow state. So we need to create that one first. So over here in our event graph, I'm going to search for a function called event blueprint initialize animation. This is an event that's called once when the animation blueprint is initialized. And I'm going to get the owning actor, so who owns this animation blueprint, which is our bow. So I'm going to cast to BP bow because we know that variable is only on our bow. And I am going to promote this to a variable, call it our bow ref. And then here in the update animation, I'm going to get my bow ref, and I'm just going to get my bow state and promote that to a variable, call it bow state as well. Great. So now we can use this variable in our transitions. So back here in our main states, going from idle to is aiming, we're going to check, is the bow state equal, so search for equal enum here, equal to aim. If that is true, then you can go into the state. And from aiming back to idle, just search for the same thing. So bow state is equal to idle, then you can enter that. And the final thing is to assign this animation blueprint to our bow. So back in our BP bow, our actor, we are going to click on the mesh and under use animation blueprint, search for a BP bow. All right, now let's test it out. So if I aim, it's not working. Let's see what I missed back here in my, oh, I forgot to connect this. Okay. So now if I compile and we try again, great, now it's working. Very nice. So you see that the animation of the bow is timed exactly with the animation of the player. So it looks like the player is holding the string and pulling it. Nice. Now, one thing we want to do as well, we're probably going to, it will come in handy later, but let's do it now. Usually when you create a state, when you create an animation blueprint from scratch, it doesn't come with something called slot. So if you right click and search for default slot, you need this node to allow you to play montages. So this allows you to play a montage in the default slot. If you have more than one slot, then you need an upper body, whatever. But put this, so we're going to play montage for the drawing the bow. All right, now let's take a break from animations for a bit and move on to something more functional. So now we are going to spawn the arrow in the hand of the player when we're aiming. So right now we don't have an arrow. As soon as we aim, we're going to spawn an arrow. So again, I created this very basic, so inside my bow mesh, I have an arrow here, so SM arrow. I modeled this in Blender. It's a very basic arrow. You can get it on my Patreon if you want to use the same one, or you can use any mesh really you want. The most important thing to know is that you want your mesh itself to be pointing in the x-axis. Or whichever axis we're going to set the velocity to, but for me, it's the x-axis. And I'm going to show you why in a bit, but just make sure that if you have your own mesh for an arrow, that it's pointing to the X and not upwards to the Z or any other direction. All right, so first we want to attach this bow to our player mesh. So if we open our skeleton here, under preview controller, let's play a specific animation. Let's play the bow aim animation and pause it right at the end here. So this will be our reference to where we're going to spawn the arrow. So the arrow is going to be on the right hand here. So we're going to search for hand_R. And under it, we're going to right click and add a socket. And this socket is going to be called the arrow_socket. So under the arrow socket, we're going to move it around to position the arrow correctly. But to preview what it looks like, we're going to add a preview asset, which is our static mesh arrow. And great. Oh, I lost my socket because I'm not searching for it. Arrow socket here. All right, so here what you want to do is you want to move it around, rotate it, and so on until it's looks like it's in the correct position. I already played around with these values before, not to bore you with them, so I'm just gonna plug them in here now. All right, so I am happy now with these values, and the arrow looks good in my mesh's hand. Obviously, again, this is just a preview. We actually need to spawn the arrow and attach it to the mesh when we are aiming. And to do that, we need to create an actor for our arrow to be able to spawn it anywhere. So I'm just going to put it in the bow folder here next to BP bow. Let's create another blueprint of type actor and call it BP arrow. Now inside this arrow, we're going to have two things. We're going to have our mesh and a collision box around the mesh because we're going to be shooting this arrow and we want to know when it collides with something. So it's very important to add the collision box first and make it, I'm going to call it collision box. And it's very important to make this the root component of your actor. So by dragging this onto default scene root, you make this the root component. And this is important for any projectile that is being launched to be the root component. Otherwise, it might mess up your collisions when the arrow is launched. And then under the collision box, we are going to add a static mesh, which will be our arrow mesh. So search here on the side under static mesh for our SM arrow. Great, now we need to adjust the size of this box so that it just encapsulates the mesh. So over here in the box extents, this one will be something like 40. This will be like, I don't know. This one is 45 maybe, 50, 52 is good. And these one are, 3 and 3. It's fine. The bigger you make this hitbox, the more, chance your arrow will hit something without actually touching it, depending on how realistic you want this to be. I'm going to make this 50, and I'm going to move my arrow just slightly back so that it's centered. Oh, I'm going to turn off the snapping. Okay. Yeah, I am happy with this. Now it's time to spawn our arrow when we are aiming. So over here, again, in our actor component for bow mechanics, this is where we do everything related to the bow. So we're going to also do spawning the arrow here. So on aim begin, we want to spawn an arrow. On aim end, we want to destroy an arrow. So I'm going to create two functions for that, just like we have equip bow here. I'm going to create a function called spawn arrow and a function called destroy arrow. Let's implement the spawn arrow first. So what it does is that it calls spawn actor from class, and the class is of course our BP arrow. And we promote that to a, well, first the spawn transform, we need to give it a value. So if a default value, so if I split, then I'm just giving it default values. These aren't important because we're going to attach it to the mesh. So these will all be overridden anyway. And then I want to promote it to a variable called our, we're going to call it our arrow ref. And then we want to attach this actor to component. So search for attach actor to component. And the component is of course our mesh. And we can get the mesh because we have a reference to our character, and the character always has a mesh. And the socket name is arrow socket. We also might want to make this a variable, just like we made the bow socket name a variable, and also the arrow class itself. Maybe you have multiple arrows, maybe you have a fire arrow, ice arrow, and so on. So maybe you want to make this a variable as well. But yeah, for now, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to make the socket a variable. So promote to variable, call it the arrow socket name. And remember, we don't assign values here. We assign values here in our player. So when we click on AC Bow Mechanics, did I compile? Nope. When we click on AC Bow Mechanics, I can add a arrow socket name here. Oh, it's good. It's already arrow socket, but that's probably because it has a default name here. It shouldn't have a default value here. It should have a value here. Okay, arrow sockets. Great. So the location and rotation and scale rules make them snap to target. This means that they take the values of the socket itself. And yep, that's pretty much it for the spawn. And for the destroy, all we need to do is check if we do have an arrow. So get our arrow ref, right click on it and convert to a validated get. This means it gets it and checks if it's valid or not. So if it is valid, then destroy it. And if it's not valid, we don't need to do anything because that means it's already destroyed. All right, so now in aim begin, let's call spawn arrow. And on aim end, let's call destroy arrow. Great, and let's test it out. All right, so I am aiming and we have an arrow. Lovely. You see? Yeah. Nice. Oh, something's weird is going on. Oh, the arrow is moving me. So I'm moving I'm moving right, but the arrow is pushing me left. That is because we forgot to disable collision on our arrow. So BP arrow on our arrow mesh here, scroll down to collision presets and set that to no collision. Because right now the arrow is colliding with my player and pushing me. All right, much better. Now there's no collisions. Great. And the arrow is perfectly placed. The bow is pulled. I am very happy with this. All right, so now why don't we shoot the arrow? So there's actually a lot involved in shooting the arrow correctly, but let's start simple and build up from there. So the first thing we need to do is to tell the arrow itself to start moving, right? At some point when something happens. But that means, so in here in our BP arrow class, we probably want a custom event called, I don't know, fire or something. Now this fire should take a direction because you're going to fire in a certain direction. So I'm going to give it an input called direction, which will be a vector. Now, we're going to calculate that direction in the player, but for now, let's just see what fire arrow does. So if I want to get something moving, and if I want any actor to move, we add a component called the projectile movement component. But I'm not going to add it from here, otherwise it's going to be added on the arrow by default when we spawn it. But instead I'm going to add it dynamically when we call the fire function. So here I'm going to say add projectile movement component. And then when you click on it, you get all of the configurations that you can set. So here you can do the max speed, initial speed, but we won't be using these. We're going to be using velocity instead of speed because velocity is also direction. So we're going to set the direction and the velocity and the speed with this velocity variable. But there are a few things important to note, which is projectile gravity scale. This is how gravity affects this component, and also rotation follows velocity. This means that if you're shooting an arrow in a certain direction and it's pointing downwards, then the mesh will also rotate to point downwards. So we want this enabled. And for now, gravity scale, let's set it as 0.5 or something. Now, the gravity scale and the velocity, they're going to be dynamic based on how much you pull the arrow backwards. But for now, again, we're starting simple, so let's just set it to a fixed number. Now, if you only do this, what happens? Let's see. So first we need to call this function from our player. Well, technically it should be in our AC bow mechanics because the player knows nothing about the arrow. So in our player here, what we need is an input. So when we, I don't know, click the left mouse button. Again, I'm going to change this to be an input action, but for now, for testing, let me just show you what it looks like. So let's say the left mouse button, when it's pressed, we want to call a function from AC bow mechanics that fires the arrow. So over to AC bow mechanics here. Remember, we only created a fire arrow function in the arrow, but nothing in the actor component. So we're going to create a custom event called fire arrow or something. Or let's say fire arrow begin, because there's probably going to be a fire arrow end. And over here, what we're going to do is just we're going to get our arrow reference. So where it is, our arrow ref here. Make sure that it's valid, so convert to a validated get. And if it is valid, we first need to detach it from the mesh. Remember, it's attached to the mesh now. So before we fire it, we need to detach it. So we call detach from component, detach, what was it, detach from actor? So the location, rotation, and scale, we're going to say keep world. So whatever you currently are, wherever you currently are in the world. And then we are going to call fire, or just fire, we called it. Direction, for now, again, we're not using direction actually yet. So nothing's going to happen, but let me show you. So now if I play, I do this, I fire, I'm clicking, nothing's happening. Oh, actually, did we call this? We didn't call it from the player. Sorry, we didn't call it. So we get our AC bow mechanics and call fire arrow begin. But now if I play and I fire, you see the arrow just, see that it just falls downwards. And nothing happens. And great. So the arrow is not moving because it doesn't have any velocity, right? So velocity is speed multiplied by direction. So let's first get some random direction for now. Let's say we get the direction that the player is facing. So the direction that the player is facing will be where is it? The character ref and get forward vector of the mesh. And let's say of the mesh. We can actually also get the forward vector of the camera. No, there's no camera on the player. Anyway, for now, starting simple. I'm going to show you the right way to do this in a bit. But for now, let's just say it's the forward vector of the mesh. Now, we have direction, but we need speed. So if we just get this direction and multiply by a float, let's say that our speed is 1,000. So now we have direction multiplied by speed. This is velocity. So we can get our projectile movement component and say set velocity. So if I set the velocity to this value, now we should have something that's moving. Whoa, it is moving, but in a different direction. Lovely. I think because we're getting the forward vector of the character, which is not correct. So where is my fire arrow again? Character mesh, get forward vector. And what we actually want is to get the forward vector of the camera, because this is where we're aiming. It's not where the mesh is looking. So to get the camera, we can just get our character ref and say get component by class and search for the camera component. And then the camera component, we can get the forward vector from that. And that will be our direction. So now if we test it out, so where I'm looking, the arrow is firing. Great. Obviously, there is a lot more that needs to be done. The arrow needs to, well, first we have to draw the bow, and depending on how strong we draw the bow, this will affect the speed, the gravity, where the arrow goes, and so on. And also, right now, I have some bugs where the arrows don't get destroyed. We need to fix that. And also, the arrow just goes through everything. It doesn't stick into any surfaces. We're going to have to fix that as well. And also when I aim, the character doesn't move up and down, so we're going to have to do that as well to be able to, for the character to look where they're aiming the arrow. We're going to cover all of that in the coming tutorials, but for this one, this is what we're going to stop at. And that's it for part 2. Coming up next, in part 3, we'll be continuing with the firing arrow mechanic, so calculating the direction correctly, calculating the speed, adding the draw state, so when you pull the bow, depending on how strong you pull it, this will affect the speed of the arrow and gravity. We'll also add a crosshair so we know when we're aiming and make that a bit dynamic. And there's going to be a lot more to come in the following episodes. So if you're enjoying this, please consider giving a like and subscribe. And if you want to download the full project files, they're available on my Patreon. You'll get the finalized series, by the way, so I have everything already final on Patreon. And of course, you'd be supporting me and the channel a lot. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.